Hello everyone, welcome to US History 12. This is our second lesson. We're going to be talking about the American involvement in both Pacific and European theaters of World War II, starting with the invasion of Western Europe. Remember, one man's invasion is another man's liberation. We're trying to liberate France from the Nazi occupation. The U.S. Chief of Staff George Marshall chose Dwight Eisenhower to lead Operation Overlord, or the Allied invasion of France. There is a picture of Dwight Eisenhower there. He'll later become president, and George Marshall will also become more important later because he will draft what's known as the Marshall Plan, which was the plan to rebuild Europe after World War II, and that will be very important once we finish talking about the war. But D-Day ends up becoming the actual invasion. June 6, 1944. Remember, the United States entered the war in December of 1941, so it took almost 3 years before they actually had an army on the ground in Europe. So it took all that time before then. The Germans were fortified in France, but they had suffered huge losses from the Eastern Front, and the Allied forces ended up winning pretty quickly, but not without a lot of sacrifice. Here's a picture of the D-Day invasion. Just think of all the personnel that this needed. Everybody in the ships, all the people who had to be landed, all of the trucks, all the supplies needed to make sure that this was successful. You can see out on the horizon there hundreds and hundreds of ships to help with the invasion plan. You can see what it was like for a lot of the men in these landers. I think that's Omaha Beach on the left, and I think that's Sword Beach on the right. But you can tell how scary this would be, especially if you're going into fortified German encampments up there. A lot of them were in bunkers and had machine guns, and a lot of times, these people had to fight their way up the beach into what would be a absolutely terrifying situation. You can see once again, this is what it looked like after the invasion had somewhat wound down, but there's still millions of people who had to make their way from the ships to France itself. And this happened all along the coast of the Normandy region of France. So there was the people at the very start who had to take out the German bunkers and encampments, and then all the people who had to come in the days and weeks later. The invasion of Western Europe ended up being very, very successful, and a lot of it was because we used German blitzkrieg tactics against them. None more famous than this guy here, General George S. Patton. Basically, he was all about making sure that his army, he was in charge of the U.S. Third Army, was constantly moving, and that they were organized and that they were charging forward ahead and not giving the Germans any time to counterattack or to make their positions more fortified. And only 2 months later, after the beginning of D-Day, Paris is liberated. So France, in general, is only liberated after a few months of fighting from the Allies. The Battle of the Bulge is kind of the German counterattack as the U.S. is getting closer and closer into German territory. This will be right around Belgium. This ends up being the largest battle ever fought by the U.S. This is the Bulge right here. The green line is where the Germans counterattacked and surrounded the U.S. First Army here in Bastogne, including the famous 101st Airborne Division, which are the ones famously in the show Band of Brothers. You can see that they were actually rescued after being stuck in the city here under siege. They were actually rescued by the Third Army, led by George Patton, who went from the southern flank and closed up this Bulge. You can see, I think this is from Bastogne at the time of the Bulge. Remember that this is the winter of 1944, and the war will be over by May of the next year of 1945. So the Americans fighting on the Western Front only have a year of fighting, but over that time they fight quite a lot of battles and are constantly moving forward deeper and deeper into German territory and German resistance. Then you can see what life was like for some of these armored convoys on the way to Germany during that time. The end of the war in Europe. So the Soviet forces were advancing from the east while the Americans and British were heading from the west. The Soviet forces fought to Berlin and actually got there first and end up completely demolishing the city. A lot of German cities will suffer that same fate, most notably Dresden, But a lot of these cities will be destroyed not only through tanks and infantry and all that, but most notably by air. This is really the war that shows how important airplanes are to modern warfare, even today. But these aerial campaigns of bombing will really affect a lot of the civilians. So if you remember the end of World War I, there was an armistice, which is just basically a ceasefire. However, in World War II, the Allies are asking for an unconditional surrender. That is where you completely surrender yourself to an enemy force and they get to decide the terms of your surrender. That's an unconditional surrender. So this is where we're actually going to go and occupy Germany for a time after the end of the war. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler ends up committing suicide, and about a week and a half later, the German High Command completely surrenders to the Allies. This is known as Victory in Europe Day, May 8th, 1945. So you can see there's a lot of celebration on the streets of London here, but there's still one Axis power still in the mix. There's still Japan, and that's what the Pacific Theater is all about. So over on the other side of the world, we have the Pacific Theater. We have some major battles like Midway and Guadalcanal. We have naval battles where it's ships versus ships. We have fights in the air around the ships. And then we have places like Guadalcanal, which is a smaller island, where it's infantry versus infantry. And the Japanese are fighting very fiercely, despite them not having the kind of numbers that the US does. This is the Pacific Theater. Here's Hawaii over here. You can just see how big of an area this was ended up being fought on. Remember, the United States had control of the Philippines after the Spanish-American War, so this was US territory, and there will be a lot of fierce fighting here. Island hopping is what's going to be happening. This was the strategy of capturing smaller islands on the way to the Japanese mainland. And the main architect of this plan is this guy named General MacArthur here. You can see him in his fancy pipe there. He ends up leading the Philippines campaign, and there's a lot of these smaller islands that the U.S. will take on their way to try to attack the Japanese mainland. There's no real landings of troops here, but there will be quite a lot of aerial raids, especially firebombing raids. And then finally, kamikazes are also going to be an issue in these battles. These are where Japanese pilots would actually strap a lot of bombs to their planes and intentionally crash them into U.S. ships. Iwo Jima would be another site of a fierce battle for 2 months between United States and Japanese forces, where this island was very small, but the Japanese were fighting basically to the death, and it took a lot of casualties and a lot of fighting before we could finally take over this island. But it ended up becoming a very useful and strategic air base for later raids into Japan. And then finally, the last thing I'll talk about is Okinawa, which is another island on the way to Japan. You can see the amphibious nature of this attack here, where you have all these ships, because our navy is going to become more and more important as the war goes on, especially in the Pacific. And then we have soldiers being landed onto the island here too. So we'll talk about the end of the war in Japan in 2 lessons. We're going to be talking about 2 of the most dramatic events that happened near the end of the war. We are going to be talking about the use of atomic weapons in Japan, how that changes the reality and nature of warfare forever, and how there'll never probably be a war like World War II ever again. We'll also be talking about the Holocaust and what ended up happening there. So it's going to be a sober time of reflection, but it's important to go over because that is, we have to remember what has happened in history. And you have to remember all this stuff didn't happen very long ago. This is only 80 years in our past. So I hope you'll join me then for when we talk about the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. Thanks, everyone.